So we have asked several times in this class, and we will continue to do so, the questions: can we prove that there is a God? You say no. You say yes. Caleb, can you break that tie? No, we cannot. There's a difference between proof and evidence. We can find lots of evidence to look at and make a decision as to whether we think that was done by an intelligent person, intelligent thing, like a God, or whether we think that that evidence points in the direction of an evolutionary process. But the point that we are trying to make here is that science cannot prove any more than the creationists can prove which is which. All we can do is look at the evidence. And as the evidence mounts, and if you watch these, I know that your mom plans on letting you watch the rest of these as we go through them. As you watch these week by week, what you're going to find is a piece of evidence, another piece of evidence, another piece of evidence, and then we're going to look at it and say, which way does that evidence point? Does it point towards evolution, or do we think that it points towards an intelligent designer of some kind? All right? So, in a court case, most of the time there's not a smoking gun. By smoking gun, I mean most of the time there is not one particular thing that says that it has to be this way. Most of the time it is mountains of evidence on one side or the other. That's what we have to look at, and that's how we come to our belief system, whether or not we believe that the evidence points this direction or whether it points this direction. And I'm going to get into that more in a future lesson, and you can see if you keep watching them. So, how can we decide? Which came first, mind or matter? Right? When you guys watch the second and third one, you're going to understand more about what I mean by this, because we go into which is more logical. Did a mind come first, or did matter come first? And by matter, I mean something that cannot think, cannot feel. That's what the evolutionary process says has to have happened, is that there is only material things in the beginning, and that mind formed, thinking formed through chemistry and electricity over time, which means they can't rely on a God. They have to rely on a rock. Okay? I find that a little absurd myself. We do this by gathering evidence. Then we determine which direction best describes what we see. Does the evidence point to a beginning from mindless matter, or does the evidence point towards some sort of a designer? And like I said, there is no smoking gun. One piece of evidence can be no one piece of evidence can be a proof. It's not. Have you taken geometry yet?
Thankfully, no.
You will eventually, and hopefully you'll get into what's known as proofs. Proofs have certain axioms. Geometry has certain axioms that are assumed to be true. And then you use those axioms to build what are called theorems. And then over time, those theorems are accumulated, and you use them to show other things must be true. That's how the process has to work, no matter if it's in law, geometry, or in how the universe started. Right? It's a process. But the accumulation of many pieces of evidence is what it takes to make that decision. And that's the way you have to look at it. So there's an atheist point of view. Matter first. Absolutely no intelligence in the beginning. If you're an atheistic evolutionist, you have to think that is true. We talked about in the first lesson, you guys have seen it, that the camera cannot evolve because it is inert matter, but they say that the eye can. And in the second one, you're going to see that why I show that they do that. All right? Mind comes from inert matter, which is what that second one is going to be about when you watch it. Comes from inert matter through chemistry and electricity. So you think not because you started out smart, according to the evolutionary atheist. You're thinking and smart not because you started out smart because of a creator, but through a rock, eventually, and electricity and chemistry entering into the moving subject and making a mind. And that's the only reason, according to evolutionary scientists, that you can think. Because otherwise, you'd still be a rock. While mutualism, we talked about that in the third and fourth lessons, while mutualism can appear designed, evolutionary biologists explain these relationships as arising through natural selection. So, that's a point of view that's opposite of an intelligent design argument. The mind came first, which I believe is a God. Some people believe that intelligence is something else. I believe it's a God. The universe appears to be designed. The I is very complex and could not have come from a mindless, inert piece of matter. That's what a creationist or an intelligent design person would have to believe. And I do. Mind first, not second. Matter came second, which is the way the Bible talks about it. We've got a God, which is mind. He created the matter. Evolution, matter came first. It created the mind. I don't see it that way. And then we talk a little bit about mutualistic symbiotic relationships, and you'll see that in another one. So, which way do we think the evidence points? And this is some of what we had talked about in some previous classes, which some of you are familiar with, and some of you will become familiar with in the near future. But we know that all of these things and more seem to be designed specifically for the purpose of maintaining the integrity of the universe and to sustain life on Earth. Not an accident, but that they were intentionally put there to sustain life and to make the world work. So, as we said several times before, what we are seeing is a conflict between two very different competing worldviews. We've said this several times. If you conclude that an intelligence created everything from nothing in a short period of time, it is often called a fairy tale by those that don't want to believe in an intelligence first. On the other hand, if you conclude that everything came from nothing or non-intelligent matter over billions of years, then it's called science. This is a guy who was a scientist. Now, it's important to know that this guy named George Wald won the Nobel Prize in Science in 1967. Smart guy. He made this statement to a group of evolutionary atheistic scientists. Listen carefully. When it comes to the origin of life on Earth, there are only two possibilities. The two possibilities we've just been talking about. Either creation or spontaneous generation. We call it matter first. He's calling it spontaneous generation first. Do you remember what spontaneous generation is?
Something came from something else.
Kind of, but it's even there's something else to it that's very important. Do you remember what spontaneous generation was? We talked about it just briefly in a previous class.
I don't, not specifically.
I know you were here for it. Do you remember? Spontaneous generation is the belief that they had up until about the 16 or 1700s that if you stuck a pile of rags someplace, then eventually old rags with nasty stuff on it, eventually mice would appear. And that if you had a pile of manure, eventually flies would appear, and then maggots. And then if you had a dying carcass, all of a sudden maggots would appear and the carcass would start. In other words, they didn't know the biological process of how those things appeared, so that they believed that spontaneously, poof, there's a new kind of life. It was an important theory for a long time. But there's several important scientists. The last one that worked on it, I think Rainier was one of them, but Louis Pasteur was the last one that kind of nailed the last nail into the coffin, so to speak. Proof beyond a shadow of a doubt that can't happen. One of the experiments he did was he took 3 jars, and on one of them, he left it open. On the second one, he put like a screen on it that you could actually, air could get in and out. And the third one, he sealed it up tight. And then he put something nasty inside of it. And what he found was the one that was open on top, the maggots and the flies would get inside. On the one where the screen was on top, they would get onto the top of it, but they couldn't get inside. And the last one, there was no flies around it at all. Which means that those things were there already, and that's spontaneous generation. In other words, life just appearing out of nowhere wasn't happening. It was just growing flies. But look at what evolutionary science has to believe. All right? He says there are only 2 possibilities, either creation or spontaneous generation. So in other words, either things were created by a mind, or there was life just appearing from non-life. A pile of manure. Okay? Dirty rags. He says there's only 2 possibilities. There is no third choice. Spontaneous generation was disproved over 100 years ago. Over 100 years ago, they said, no, that can't happen. But that leads us, evolutionary atheistic scientists, only to one other conclusion, and that is supernatural creation. Unfortunately, we cannot accept that on philosophical grounds. In other words, they don't want to believe in a creator. So what do? They choose to believe the impossible, that life arose spontaneously by chance. He's admitting that there is a big problem with their theory, but they have to believe it, because otherwise, if they don't, they have to believe in the other alternative. Does it make sense? To me, that kind of tells a little bit about where they're coming from. A couple of new terms we're going to start using between now and throughout a bunch of the class. So I'm just introducing them at this point. If you believe, if your belief is that matter came first, then vast amounts of time are necessary. And there are 2 terms that are used for this. One of them is gradualism. And another one is naturalistic processes. They'll use that term also. And the third one is uniformitarianism. All that means is that things happen gradually, step by step, over a long, long, long period of time. So in other words, they can't believe that a princess kissed a frog and immediately it turned into a prince. But they can believe that a rock got into a soup and there was a lightning storm and the chemicals made a single cell and then over a long, long period of time turned into a prince. The only difference between what I think and what they think is time. But I start with a mind, they don't start with a mind. And if they're not starting with a mind, they have to have it as gradualism, as uniformitarianism, as natural processes. Make sense? All right. Gradualism is fundamental to evolution. It is crucial to the Darwinian idea of natural selection. It is where the billions of years come from. Without billions of years, atheistic evolution is impossible. Some people that claim to be Christians, say they're Christians, and I believe that they probably are, still think that there was a long, long, long period of years. And some think that there is a short, short, short period of years. All right? I have my own belief on that. I'm probably going to share it in a future class, but I'm going to lead up to it first as to why I believe it one way or another. It's taken me my whole life to come up with it. But the point is that they have to have the gradual long periods of time. I don't. Okay? If I found out it was for sure it was one way or another, it wouldn't matter to me. They have to have it. because otherwise theirs looks like a fairy tale. Got it? They talk about the fittest surviving, and only the fittest survive because over time they have been selected to survive. Matter changed into a single cell, and then through the single cell it changed into a person, which eventually changed into an eye. Matter over time developed these symbiotic relationship that we talked about in a couple of past classes. And this is in opposition to the intelligent creative force and catastrophism, which is the opposite side, that says, God said, let there be, and it was so. Or that maybe that there was some huge catastrophe like the flood or the fall of man in Genesis chapter 3 that changed things in a much shorter period of time. All right? That's the 2 points of view. So today, with that little bit of background, I want to begin to talk about something called irreducible complexity. Okay? Irreducible complexity. To do this, we're going to look at a couple examples first. Because we're not going to just talk about it from a living perspective. We're going to talk about it first, excuse me, from a mechanical perspective. Now, I hope everybody here is wishing, that I don't snap my fingers. Hey, Grace, would you help me?
X-ray.
I don't want you to snap your fingers by accident, okay?
I show mouse control in the church, so.
You've done this?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, you can see that one. You can see that one works, all right? I'm not going to set it again. The problem was that little piece right there came off. And that's why I don't want you to do it, because your mom's going to have to deal with a broken finger.
Why don't you play John's music?
Yeah, I should have. All right, so let's look at this. The definition of irreducible complexity states that certain biological systems are too complex to have evolved through natural selection. Biological systems with multiple interacting parts would not function if one of those parts were removed. And this is where I'm going to give you some examples, and the first one here is the mousetrap. You saw a second ago that when the mousetrap is fully assembled, that it works, right? It almost got me instead of the mouse. But what if we took the mousetrap and we took away one part? See how there's these different parts. There's the base, the hammer, the spring, the latch, right here, and the trigger. All right? What if I take away the latch, which this one doesn't have a latch? Will it work? No. What if I take, like I have in this one, the hammer away and the spring? Will it work? So those right there are what is known as irreducibly complex. If all the parts are not there, if even one part is missing, and if it's not set by somebody, it won't work. Understand what irreducible complexity is now? Good. Irreducibly complex.
Irreducibly complex.
What is that?
Just.
Yeah, we're going to see that in just a second. Don't get ahead of me. I got one more example first. This example, I'm just joking. This example, a long time ago, to show some kids, I took a weed whacker engine apart. Anybody ever seen the inside of an engine? Jason, have you?
Oh, yeah.
Good. And you're already familiar with this. Have you seen the inside of an engine? I would imagine you did, because I know your grandpa works on it, right? So he's probably let you do that. So what we have here is, you guys seen the inside of one? No? All right, we're going to do this now. This right here is called the crank. That's that thing inside here. And you can see that I can take this right here and I can spin that crank around and around and around. But in order for this to go round and around and around, that crank has got to be attached to something, right? What's it attached to is this cylinder and this piston. So inside here, this goes up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down. It's attached to that part right there, and as it goes up and down, it turns this around, which in turn turns the head on the weed whipper and cuts all the weeds. Okay? With me? But in order for this to work, it has to have gasoline. Go ahead. It has to have gasoline so it can have the explosion to force this up and down. But in order to have the gasoline explode, it has to have a spark plug. So you got all these parts inside of this simple engine that make it so that it'll work. If I take the spark plug away, it won't ignite the gas. If I take the gas away, there's nothing to explode. If I take the piston away, there's nothing to go up and down and make the crank go. If I take the crank away, then there's nothing to turn. Do you see how all the pieces still have to be there? There's lots of things that we make that are irreducibly complex. They have to be put together in the same order, and they have to have all the pieces. So, I'm going to show you very quickly just a couple of really short videos on how an engine works. And then after that, we're going to get into some machines that are inside of you and see whether or not you think that the evidence shows that they were accidental or whether they had to be put together by an intelligence. Because truly, this has to be put together by an intelligence, right? All right. So here's the first one. This is a guy explaining a little bit about this two-cycle motor right here.
Design is a piston that acts like a piston.
I'm going to, I never have this turned up enough, so it turns it down. So I'm going to turn the volume up so that people at home can actually hear this. You ready?
The key to the two-stroke design is a piston that acts like a piston, a compressor, and an intake and an exhaust valve. If you watch a two-stroke engine go through its two strokes, you can see exactly what's happening. Let's start with the spark plug firing. At this point, the piston is at the top of its stroke. The cylinder is full of air and gasoline that has been compressed. When the spark plug fires, it lights the gasoline. The gasoline bursts into flame and expands rapidly, driving the piston down with a lot of force. See this area behind the piston? It's filled with air and a mixture of gasoline and oil. As the piston moves back into this area, it compresses the mixture. As the piston gets near the bottom of its stroke, it uncovers a port. That port lets the exhaust gases escape into the exhaust pipe. Then, just a fraction of a second later, the piston uncovers another port. That port lets a new charge of air and gasoline into the cylinder. Now the piston starts moving back toward the spark plug, compressing the air and gasoline mixture so the spark plug can fire again. This cycle repeats thousands of times per minute.
All right. Now, this next one is a short video on it actually happening and how fast it goes on inside this cylinder. It's a four-stroke engine, which is a little different than this, but the principle is the same. Okay, watch this one.
Wide open throttle. The crankshaft may turn at 5,000 RPMs, or a dizzyingly 83 times per second. Meanwhile, the piston traveled up and down 166 times in that same second. Want to see how fast that is? Now, that's fast. Let's see it again. Amazingly, the four-stroke EFI engine does this smoothly, quietly, and reliably for years and years of operation.
That's what goes inside your car motor. Only there's not just one piston. There can be 4, 6, or even 8, all going up and down, turning a crank that does some kind of work of, in this case, turning the tires through a bunch of other mechanisms. And all that has to be put in place at the same time with all the parts or it doesn't work. It's irreducibly complex. Any questions on that so far before we get into some things that are from biology instead. Right? So we're going to talk a little bit about the cell. Are there any things that are irreducibly complex in nature? And the answer is yeah, the cell has parts in it that are. Darwin's favored author, in other words, the guy that, Darwin's favorite authority on cell complexity was a guy named George Lewes. There was a lot of guys at the time that were experts, but Darwin relied a little bit on this guy. And he described the cell as a structure with mysterious powers surrounded by a microscopic lump of jelly. So it was simple in his day. In fact, so simple, that's what his drawings look like. That's the guy's drawings during Darwin's day of a cell. Fast forward about 80 years, now you're in, like when I'm young in school, elementary, junior high, and this is the drawing I would have made. Not a lot different, a little bit, but not a lot different than what Darwin had originally conceived. They knew that there was some stuff going on inside of that, but they didn't have technologies to look inside and actually figure out what was going on. So it was viewed as showing a cell wall and a nucleus. The white spots were called vacuoles. Most of the material inside the cell wall was protoplasm, and then viewed through a microscope, the protoplasm, they knew that there was motion inside of it. Here is a short video that I would have probably watched something like that when I was very young in school, probably on the old 16 millimeter projectors. They didn't have videotape back then. All right.
One way to find out more about living things is to look at them with a microscope. Let's begin by looking at a common plant, an onion. We see that the piece of onion plant is made up of a great many little sections close together. These are living cells, each one about 1/100th of an inch long. Thousands of them make up the onion plant. The cells we are looking at are pale, but we can see the structure of the cells more clearly by staining them with a dye, such as iodine solution. When a drop of iodine is put on the slide, it seeps into the onion cells and colors them. Now we can see the parts of each cell distinctly. Each cell is a separate little structure. The pointer shows us the cell wall. Within each cell is a darker mass, which is called the nucleus. Scientists have discovered that almost every plant cell has a cell wall and a nucleus. The cells we've been looking at appear flat because we are seeing only one side. A diagram will help us see a cell as it really is. Every cell has thickness. Here is the cell wall. Inside it is the nucleus. The small white drops are called vacuoles. Most of the material inside the cell wall is protoplasm. Let's look at the protoplasm in the cells of this common water plant. The microscope shows us that protoplasm is alive. See how it moves, continually streaming about within the cell wall. Protoplasm is the life substance of plants and of animals. Scattered throughout the protoplasm of this leaf are many tiny green particles. These green particles are important to all of us, for in them is made the food of the plants. And plants, in turn, are the food of animals and of man. Most of us have heard about blood cells.
All right, enough on that. You notice, first of all, they said, notice the green stuff, but it's in black and white. When I was in elementary school, they didn't have color television. You didn't see that, all right? Do you notice that their drawings aren't much different? What they see under a microscope is not much different than that in the 1800s. It's the 1950s when that was taking place. Now, I want to show you, more recently, cell is often compared to a factory. I'm going to show you a rendering of what they know is inside a cell now, and I want you to make a comparison. It's like a factory, and it contains specialized structures called, and there's some of these names I don't know how to pronounce for sure, and they're working together to produce necessary products for the cell's function. And in turn, if they're making the cell function, then they're actually perpetuating your life, because the cells are important to your life. There are like 1 trillion cells inside your body. Notice that the cell nucleus is said to be categorized as if it had a mind. That's what this was saying, as if it had a mind of some sort to orchestrate and direct the rest of the parts of the cell. They know that that's true now, because this is what they know inside a cell looks like. Look how much more complex that is. We're gonna show a short video on 2 different parts of the cell. All these different colored things are different parts inside the cell. They're all different machines. We're going to look at this little green part here called kinesis, and then I don't see it in here, but we're also going to talk about a bacterial flagellum also. What's that?
It's like a seizure. It's like something you see.
Yeah, but if you see it all working at the same time, and I've seen some stuff before, I can't find it, or I'd show it to you. I can't find it now. I wish I'd have saved it. It looks like it's a factory going on in there. All right? So, this is a depiction of the inside of what a cell really looks like that they know now, because they got much better equipment to look at them. But these mechanisms are so small they can't even be photographed, because they're shorter than the light waves that they would have to use to take pictures of them. They're that small. So I think I found out that this thickness right here of a piece of paper is 100,000 nanometers. Well, we're going to look next at what's called the flagellum. It's only 50 nanometers. So take 50, divide it into 100,000. See, 1,000 in it would be, so there would be 200 of these flagellums in that thickness right there. And that's what we're going to talk about next, is the bacteria flagellum. They're tiny. They're tiny, tiny. And they're all over inside you and everybody else. This is what they look like. The bacterial flagellum, first seen under a microscope in the 17th century. It's been a long time. They'd known it was there, but they didn't know how complex it was or what it looked like. But it was not understood until the 1970s. I was out of high school by then. So what I learned about the cell and some of that stuff when I was in elementary school had totally changed by the time I was graduated. And this is one of the guys that was instrumental in promoting what was going on inside. It's a guy named Michael Behe. I have a couple of his books. This one right here, if you want to read some really good reading, a little bit technical, it's called Darwin's Black Box. A black box is kind of a thing that when you look inside, you can't see all the complexity, and it's almost like a Pandora's box when you open it up, that once you look inside and you know what's inside, it's different than what you thought it was. All right? So what he did in this book was he compares what the thought was for hundreds of years on what a cell was, and then he said that Darwin had actually opened that box, but he didn't know what was inside of it. But now that they know what's inside of it, you can't apply the same rules that Darwin did, because it's much, 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 much more complex. So he says, there is an elephant in the room full of scientists. You know what an elephant in the room means, isn't it? Don't you? It's like something that's big, but everybody ignores. There is an elephant in the room full of scientists who are trying to explain the development of life. The elephant is labeled intelligent design. They all know something had to start this, but they want to believe that it was just matter. But this is so complex that how could it be matter like a rock that started it when it looks like it's designed by an intelligence? Life on Earth at its most fundamental level, in its most critical components, is the product of intelligent activity. That's in this book right here on page 193. For the Darwinian theory of evolution to be true, it has to be accurate for the molecular structures of life. It can't just be true for the big overarching things that they say that we went from a monkey to a man. It has to be correct on the cellular level. Right? And that's what he's saying can't happen. Life is lived with the details, and it is molecules that handle life's details. So he's a big proponent now of the theory that there was intelligence behind what we see in the universe. Right? He's not even advocating at this point that it was a God of the Bible, but he is saying that it wasn't a rock. It wasn't matter. It had to have intelligence. This is the structure of what's called the bacterial flagellum. And what you'll notice is there are a bunch of little pieces, parts, that are on there. We're going to see a movie in just a second where he explains what those parts are. There are parts that have to be put together or this doesn't work. And that's just one piece of these cell structures, not including all the other stuff. So this is his explanation of it. And he's going to go through a motor and some other stuff to get to it. But he can explain it a whole lot better than I can.
In a way, cell biologists are like auto mechanics. Each cell has an astonishing number of intricate parts, way more than any car. We study what the parts are, how the parts work together, and even which parts of the cell can be left out without causing too much harm. If you understand the inner workings of the cell, you can understand a lot about all living things. Right now, I want to look at the topic of complexity. You and I are made of about 40 trillion cells. They comprise every part of our complex human anatomy. But the truth is that we can reduce the number of parts and still have function. If we lost an eye, an ear, or a hand, it would be very unfortunate, but our lives would go on. The same applies to this rather complex drill. It has some cool add-ons, but I could take off this battery gauge, or this LED light, or a few other gadgets, and I'd still have a working drill. But how far can I reduce its complexity and not ruin it? I don't want to take apart my drill, so let me move to another example. This mousetrap. The complexity of this machine entails 5 parts: the platform, the spring, the hammer, the holding bar, and the catch. Now, if I reduce the number of parts from 5 to 4, if I take away the holding bar, or the spring, or any other part, it wouldn't work. Every part is essential. I call this irreducible complexity. So does this apply to biology too? Do we have examples of irreducible complexity in life? Try this one. Here's a bacterium, a single-cell microbe. Some bacteria have a flagellum, which is like an outboard motor on a boat. It rotates to propel bacteria through liquid, and it's necessary for their survival in order to swim to search for food. A flagellum has a number of parts: a drive shaft, a universal joint, a rotor, bushings, stator, even a clutch and braking system. The motor of the flagellum has been clocked at 100,000 revolutions per minute. And as with the mousetrap, removing even one component of this elegant machine destroys its function and renders the bacterium, shall we say, dead in the water. The flagellum is irreducibly complex. Now we know that this was assembled in a factory, but how is the bacterial flagellum developed in nature? Keep in mind, the flagellum is irreducibly complex. All the parts have to be in place, or it does not work.
All right. See that comparison? All right. Pay attention because next week we're going to talk about a little bit. They even asked this last week. What is their response to this? We're going to talk a little bit about that. So how could this tiny, tiny, tiny piece of machinery, which is irreducibly complex, be able to build itself over time when it has to have all its parts in place before it will even function and do its job, which is necessary for life, which came from a rock?
Yes.
I don't think it can. Is that proof? No, but it's a strong piece of evidence, I think, for a creator or an intelligent designer rather than by accident, chance, and no mind in the first place. And that's the whole point. There's another one I want to show you that's short. And this one has to do with a delivery device inside the cell, that one that I showed you, that little picture of, called the kinesin. Now the kinesin is this small part right here. It travels on a road that builds itself, you'll see in a second, as it goes along. And it carries a payload that's important to a different part of the cell. The nucleus is directing all this. It's the boss. So the nucleus has to be smart. Where did it get its smarts from? But this piece right here, the kinesin, is kind of like that tractor trailer. All it is a device to pull that FedEx truck. And it's tiny. Tiny, tiny. This is how tiny.
Cells are full of specialized components that perform functions vital to their existence. But how do these components get to the right locations inside the cell to perform their functions? For larger components, a transportation system is needed. Meet the kinesin. Masterpieces of microengineering, kinesins are miniature motorized machines that carry cargo from one part of the cell to another, walking along self-assembling highways called microtubules. Known as the workhorses of the cell, kinesins have 2 feet, or globular heads, that literally walk 1 foot over another along the microtubule, pulling their cargo to its destination. Each foot possesses 2 special locations, called binding sites, that interact with other molecules. One site attaches to the microtubule, and the other binds with ATP, the energy molecule of the cell. When one foot binds with ATP and uses its energy, the foot flips over, resulting in the walking motion. Each foot has a short neck, which is connected to a strand of a long coiled stalk. At the end of the stalk is a fan-shaped tail, which holds tightly to the cargo being transported. Kinesins can carry cargo that are many times their own size. Sometimes a kinesin is in danger of getting stuck on a microtubule highway because of blockages caused by other cellular components. To get around such obstacles, multiple motor proteins may be used to carry a single piece of cargo, together providing enough force to break free. Kinesins typically walk away from the center of the cell and toward the cell's periphery. The kinesin's 2 feet work together efficiently, with 1 foot holding fast to the microtubule, while the other releases itself and takes a step forward. This coordinated stepwise movement allows kinesin motors to walk as many as 100 steps per second, moving about 8 nanometers with each step. When not carrying cargo, kinesins can shift to energy-saving mode to conserve fuel until their next job. The kinesin plays a vital role in many cellular processes, not just transporting materials, but also aiding cell replication. The walking kinesin molecular machine, another example of intelligent design.
So, a couple of quick things before we end up. Notice that You ever seen a big, long train on the tracks that have more than one engine in front? Because the payload is so big, they need more force to pull it. This knows enough to have two of those if it needs it. If by some chance it's stuck or if the payload is too heavy, they can add another one. Who's telling it to do that? All right? Another thing, how many RPMs, revolutions per minute, does a normal engine go around? Do you remember? What's your tachometer say at the high end?
High end, 6 to 8 maybe.
Most cars, about 5. They can go higher than that depending on the engine.
Not done.
How in that bacteria flagellum, how many revolutions per minute, how many RPM did they say that goes around per minute? 100,000. So these machines are technically better than the ones that we have, even though they are so microscopic we can't photograph them, but they are necessary for life, and yet evolutionary scientists, atheistic evolutionary scientists, have to admit that they happen by accident, but the ones that we have that are inferior had to be designed. I'm not going to talk about the next thing simply because we're running out of time, but I do want to show you this. This is a person that I think kind of agrees with what we're saying here. He says that if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, in other words, through gradualism over a long period of time, then my theory would absolutely break down, wouldn't work. But I cannot find such a case. The reason why I couldn't was it was the 1800s, and the person that said this was Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin knew that if they started finding some of this stuff, his theory doesn't work, and yet they're still sticking to it today.
It's because they don't want to believe in God or don't want to fix God.
That's kind of what George Wald was saying, isn't it? Okay? We choose to believe the impossible because we can't accept the alternative? Absolutely.
I remember a lesson a couple of years ago. 100 reasons why evolution is stupid. This kind of adds in more.
Yeah.
More
Yeah. So, that's all I got for today. We will continue again next week. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank
You usually do.
It's also going to go well with my biology classes.
Good. Good. No question?
I got one.
Yeah.
So, the cell has multiple parts. Each one of those parts have parts.
Probably.
Oh, wow. And then each one of
They
those
get tinier and tinier, don't they?
But they have to
They
stay
get more and more complex. I don't even think that we've seen inside the cell all the way down yet to even know how that stuff that we do see works. Plus, when the Bible says, we'll bring this out more later, when the Bible says that we are beautifully and wonderfully made, do you think this is part of it? So that no matter how high-tech you get, there's still going to be a question as to how this could happen by accident? And as the theory comes up, it says something about somebody's not believing in God, all of a sudden something else shows up that shows that it couldn't happen the other way.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're going to talk more about that throughout the rest of this class. Good comment.
Yeah.